When the Third Reich fell in 1945, the world had no idea Adolf Hitler was a secret billionaire.
He loved money all the time. He just wasn't prepared to do much work for it.
Who had stolen from his own countrymen.
He looks at Germany and he looks at himself as being one.
Who dictated a last will and testament just hours before committing suicide. A tax evader who tried to hide the true nature of his wealth.
And here you can see a lot of the things he just put a line through.
Who collected great works of art for his own glory.
He set out to form the world's supreme museum.
Who built a secret property empire.
All of these blue dots having something to do with Hitler and the Nazi Party.
And whose name and image could make another fortune.
Whoever owns those intellectual property rights can continue to receive the income stream.
This film will reveal how the Fuhrer really made his money.
This is Hitler the man.
And the man who translated his will tells his story for the first time on television.
We were absolutely shocked at what was discovered.
In every city and town, the Nazis fight back with furious desperation.
As the Russian army closed in on Adolf Hitler and his fellow Nazis in 1945, the Fuhrer realized the game was up and he'd lost the war.
On the final lap of their drive on Berlin, Russian troops send the Germans reeling.
Just before dawn on April 29th, in his underground bunker in Berlin, he gathered his most trusted staff and aides together, married his longtime mistress, Eva Braun, and then began to dictate a will.
Mein politisches Testament. Es ist unwahr, dass ich
It took 10 pages to set out what he called his political testament,
für jüdische Interessen arbeiteten.
a rant against the Jewish people, blaming them for the war.
Sollte diese nicht mehr existieren,
And then he devoted just 3 pages to his personal wealth and wishes, leaving it to his executor, Martin Bormann, to decide what each friend and relative got.
Berlin. Adolf Hitler.
It was 9 days after his 56th birthday.
This is London Court. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
2 days later, when the Russians finally broke into Hitler's bunker, they were able to see how the Fuhrer had spent his final days, surrounded by oil paintings and fine furniture. But no trace of his will was found. It had already been smuggled out of Berlin. It's been almost 70 years since Hermann Rothman first came to this part of northern Germany as an intelligence officer in the British Army.
I thought I would have an odd feeling. We mustn't forget it was 1945. We are now in 2013. It's like entering into something new, which I've never seen before.
This was once a German prisoner of war camp called Stalag 11B. Almost 100,000 Allied troops were interned here. In the summer of 1945, the camp was in the hands of the Allies, processing captured Germans. Rothman was part of a specialist German-speaking team trained to weed out SS and Nazi officers on the run.
We decided whether people are going to stay in this camp or what's going to happen. Some were quite open and frank, some were not. Some concealed what really happened. And we had to make up our mind whether speaking the truth or not.
Rothman's motivation for finding Nazis was stronger than most.
My father was taken to concentration camp. And once I heard that, I think I cried, because I knew that I wouldn't see my father again. A lot of people like myself, Jewish refugees, it was our desire to see that Hitler should be beaten as quickly as possible, and I joined the army. I was 18.
Then, Hermann Rothman's world changed when he received an early morning call from his commanding officer.
Remember that I was woken up at 5 o'clock in the morning. Was told that I must come immediately. I said, well, what's so urgent? He said, I can't explain anything on the telephone. Please come in.
Rothman's colleagues had identified a German who they believed was not telling the truth. The man had been attempting to sell a story to the newspapers about Hitler's last days in the bunker. A routine search had already been carried out. But one of Rothman's colleagues wasn't satisfied.
In our unit, there was a man who was a tailor by profession. He saw it immediately there's something wrong. The shoulder pads don't look right. And he ripped it open, and he found documents. It's difficult to describe a reaction which one had at the time. We were absolutely shocked at what was discovered. When we saw the signature of Adolf Hitler, it became evident that this was an exceptionally important document.
Rothman realized he was looking at what might be the Fuhrer's last will and testament.
What I knew by interrogating Nazis, I had a picture of Hitler which made me think it was genuine. The way he spoke, he kept in character.
The man's name was Heinz Lorenz. A deputy press officer on Hitler's staff, he'd been on the run for more than 2 months. He confessed that he'd been entrusted by Hitler to smuggle the will out of the bunker.
My commanding officer said, please close all the doors, close the windows, lock them.
Behind the closed doors, Rothman and the rest of the team begin translating the will.
It was on parchment.
Hitler's character shone through.
It was in 2 sections. One was a private one, in which he disposed of his goods, which he had very little of apparently, and gave it back to the German Reich. And on the other hand, he made a political will, which was, of course, a diatribe against who was responsible for the war, which was the Jewish people.
Mein politisches Testament. Es ist unwahr, dass ich oder irgendjemand anderer in Deutschland...
The rant against the Jews in the political will is followed by the naming of a new Nazi government.
Mein privates Testament.
And Hitler's brief 3-page private will disguises the fact that he was a rich man.
I think the private will was also for consumption to the German people. He wanted to show in his private will he had very little. I always felt that he thought about it very, very clearly. I wanted to show the people I had no benefits. My life was purely devoted entirely to the welfare of the German people. And that is what was evidenced by reading the private will.
Ist eine weitere Entscheidung von mir nicht
Hitler leaves his possessions, insofar as they are worth anything, to the Nazi Party. He leaves his paintings, the ones bought by me, to what he calls a picture gallery in his hometown of Linz. Martin Bormann becomes his sole executor, with the full legal authority to make all decisions relating to personal mementos and the distribution of money to maintain the present standard of living of Hitler's siblings, mother-in-law, and faithful fellow workers.
Adolf Hitler.
Reading Adolf Hitler's will for the first time made Hermann Rothman want to know more about the motives of the man who dictated it.
What was the real Hitler? What makes this man tick? How did he get all this power, this immense power? How he used the power? Did he use it entirely for the German people? Well, some will think yes. On the other hand, you'll find that people will say no. He projected one image to the German people, and there was a real Hitler.
After the war, the real Hitler was hard to find. Whatever he left behind in the Fuhrer bunker was taken by the Russians or souvenir hunters. The Allies seized his Munich apartment and bombed his country residence in the Bavarian mountains. Most of his huge personal art collection was missing. And the man who knew how to get his hands on Hitler's money, Martin Bormann, was found dead in a Berlin street 2 days after his boss committed suicide. Finally, in 1948, an Allied denazification court valued his entire estate at just 200,000 Deutschmarks, roughly $60,000. The Bavarian State Archives keeps German artifacts of great historical value, particularly those from the Second World War. Dr. Helen Fry is a historian who's discovered there are traces of the real Hitler to be found if you know where to look and can get permission. Hidden away in cardboard boxes.
After Hitler's death, a number of his belongings were gathered from different residences all over Germany and Austria. And here, gosh, this is his gun license. A very young Hitler here, and he's actually signed across the photograph. Oh, look, Hitler with his mother. There are rumours that this was a very important personal photograph for him. He used to keep it at all times on him.
Clara Hitler gave birth to 6 children. Adolf was one of only 2 to survive childhood. The other was his sister, Paula. His father, Alois, had been married twice before, and so Adolf already had an older half-brother and sister when he was born in April 1889.
Now here we have a document.
In this box, there are more than just personal and family mementos.
This is his original, well, the first will, 1938.
Hitler had set out plans for the distribution of his wealth once before. Written in his own hand at the age of 50, when he was already ruling Germany. Hitler was convinced he would die young from a major illness, just as both his parents had while he was still a child. But unlike his final will, this one gives much more financial detail.
Fräulein Eva Braun, München, auf Lebenszeit monatlich 1.000 Mark. Also jährlich.
It names his heirs and exactly how much he wishes to leave each.
Dresden, auf Lebenszeit monatlich 1.000 Mark.
This is Hitler the man. You know, he's leaving ordinary possessions, a certain amount of money to his sister, his stepbrother, his housekeeper.
He left his sister Paula 1,000 marks a month, equal to $650 back then. Had Hitler died in 1938, In the first year alone, his estate would have had to pay out nearly $60,000, over $1 million in today's money.
Oh, yeah, Hitler the artist.
But Hitler was not always rich. In fact, he was once very poor, selling his own drawings on postcards for just a few cents. Homeless and hungry, he gave up his artistic career and fashioned a new image.
Image was very important to him. He took acting lessons, he took speaking lessons from professionals, how to present himself on stage. Photographs were taken so that he could view himself and decide just how to be. It's the image of power.
Der Führer hat das Wort. Sie soll sehen, dass das, was ich erkläre, nicht die Sprache eines ganzen
Hitler styled himself as the people's leader. He quickly realized the money-making potential of personal appearances, and right from the start, misled his followers.
His notepaper is very pretentiously labeled "From the Chancellery of Adolf Hitler." This is, we're talking 1920s, before he'd come anywhere near power. He used to say that he took no fees for his speeches. Oh yeah, he didn't even have a bank account. And yet, underneath the Chancellery, on the notepaper, it gives you his bank account number.
Chris Wetton is a British author who has spent a decade trying to work out what Hitler was worth when he died.
Let's try to talk in today's figures. I would say for his lifestyle that he was probably pushing 30 to 50,000 euros a year. But by the time we get to 1944, he's definitely in the billions of Reichsmarks, which would not be far off billions of euros today.
Hitler set the foundation for his billions way back in 1923, when he was sent to prison for 9 months for trying to overthrow the German government. While inside, he wrote the book which was to become the basis of his fortune, Mein Kampf. Published in 1924, Hitler received a 10% royalty from every sale. But it took a while to get going.
Well, concerning the different versions of Mein Kampf, there are many of them. I just picked out some to give you a general idea. I brought along the very first edition, which appeared in 2 volumes. It was pretty expensive at the time, 10, 12 marks. This was a lot to deal with during the early 1920s, and they sold so-so. To be perfectly frank, it's not exactly a good read. So later on, they got this idea to produce a popular version.
The popular version changed Hitler's fortunes. As soon as the money started to roll in, Hitler raised his standard of living. He bought himself a luxury Mercedes and came up with the idea that would make him even richer. When Hitler was elected chancellor in 1933, newlywed German couples would get a free copy of Mein Kampf.
Of course, there were a lot of marriages, there always are. And they all had to be paid for by the state. So the state bought the books to present to every married couple, and Hitler reaped the profits.
At its peak, Mein Kampf was earning Hitler $1 million a year in royalties alone, equivalent to $12 million today. By the time the war ended, nearly 10 million copies of Mein Kampf had been printed. And Hitler once boasted that his book was only outsold by the Bible.
He loved money all the time. He just wasn't prepared to do much work for it. He liked having it. It gave him the freedom to do whatever he wanted.
Whatever he wanted wasn't enough. In 1938, he owed 400,000 Deutschmarks in tax, $120,000 back then.
He felt that paying taxes was beneath him. By the time he's become Chancellor, the authorities, presumably with a little bit of pressure, said, we think it's reasonable that as Chancellor, Herr Hitler should not pay tax, and therefore we will take all of his tax papers and they will be destroyed. Well, they weren't. They were locked in a safe, conscientious civil servants. And here is a copy from 1925 through to 1933. A lot of the things he just put a line through. Look, everything dashed out. Blank, blank. The tax authorities, they always wanted to know what happened to the collections and the admission fees for the meetings that he spoke at. And he would say, I don't know. It doesn't come to me. It goes to the National Socialist Party.
Hitler was also secretly investing his money in a property empire. He had a luxury apartment in the center of Munich, and also an interest in a villa used by his mistress, Eva Braun. But his real home and most valuable asset was in a far more desirable location. Since the early 1920s, Hitler holidayed near the Alpine village of Berchtesgaden on the southern tip of Germany, close to the border with Austria.
He fell in love with Berchtesgaden area. It was his ambition to get a house there, which he did. There's a lot of documentation about the property around the Obersalzberg, particularly this one from 1937. And here we see the house Wachenfeld as it was when Hitler bought it. And we have the price here, 40,000 gold marks. And he slowly enlarged it. He was very, very proud of it.
Hitler called his home the Berghof, 30 rooms filled with expensive furniture, rare Persian carpets, tapestries, and paintings by Dutch, Italian, and German masters. Table silver engraved with the initials AH and stamped with the German eagle and Nazi swastika. And there were other changes by his own hand, but not always successful.
He fancied himself as an architect, although he had no formal training whatsoever. And he went ahead to modify the house himself to suit his grandiose vision. He had this huge picture window, and right underneath it was the garage. So anytime anybody started a car in the garage, up came the fumes from the exhaust straight through the open picture window.
The Berghof was one of the few places Hitler could relax with Eva Braun. From the very beginning, he had tried to keep their relationship a secret from the German people. We are only able to see this today because Eva Braun was a home movie fanatic, and no one dared stop her from filming or being filmed. Hitler spent more and more time at the Berghof, surrounded by loyal henchmen, barely recognizable without their Nazi uniforms.
And we see here on the map, point 16, this was House Wachenfeld, which became the Berghof. But by 1944, all of these blue dots, each one having something to do with Hitler and the Nazi Party. They're the hangers-on, Goebbels, Goering, Speer, plus SS barracks, anti-aircraft emplacements, and so on and so forth.
Eventually, Hitler's mountain retreat became the unofficial second seat of the Third Reich. Hitler wasn't just focused on military victory. He was also fighting a dirty cultural war.
Hitler, the man who wanted to rule the world, is only the public face. The private man is something that few people seem to understand. His beating heart was all to do with art, on which he had strong judgments. He held dinner parties at Berchtesgaden in which the arts were freely discussed with visiting generals, and not a word is spoken about the blood spilt in camps within 50 miles. Dachau, the village south of Munich, which housed one of the filthiest of the concentration camps, was also a place where Hitler housed art. Somehow, this schizophrenic person managed to live in two different worlds.
Godfrey Barker is an expert on Hitler the art lover.
That's just fine. Hitler was an artist. He leaves behind about 2,300 watercolors, mostly of fine classical architecture and buildings. They're meticulous, they're well executed, but they're invariably wooden and lifeless.
Hitler became an art collector in the 1930s.
Ich habe meine Gemälde in den von mir im Laufe der
In his
Jahre
will,
gekauft.
he leaves his paintings to an as yet unbuilt Fuhrer museum in his hometown of Linz in Austria.
Aufbau einer Galerie in meiner Heimatstadt Linz an der Donau gesammelt.
By the end of the war, he'd gathered 8,500 paintings for this purpose. That aroused my interest.
Hitler and his fellow Nazis were art collectors on an industrial scale. The whole of Europe was at their mercy. What they liked, they took. But the Fuhrer was an exception. He not only stole, he also used his own money to buy.
I had expected to find that he was directly responsible for looting of, and stealing of paintings that he wanted for himself, and I couldn't find any evidence for it. I found evidence that he paid for them, sometimes at knockdown prices, but not direct theft in any way. I was quite surprised by this, and I have to say, in all honesty, that's what I found. Didn't expect it, but I did.
When the Allies started to look for Hitler's art collection after his death, they couldn't find most of it. Nor could they trace the vast art haul stolen by his fellow Nazis. It was as if it had been spirited away. The Austrian village of Altaussee lies close to the southern German border, 50 miles from Hitler's house in Berchtesgaden. In April and May 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled, it was overrun by Nazis looking for somewhere to hide. But it also harbored another secret. Deep inside the mountains, 40 miles of tunnels on 18 levels had been carved out by miners extracting salt from the limestone rock. Many of these chambers date back over 1,000 years.
Salz war sehr, sehr wichtig.
Salt has always been very important and has given the community an identity. This has led to uproars against authority since the Middle Ages.
Aufstände gegeben hat.
Helmut Kahls is a leading authority on the Altaussee salt mine, which was used by the Nazis to store art. They were inspired by a miner's chapel deep below ground.
Und in dieser Kapelle
In the chapel, there were paintings for many years, and they were well preserved. So you realize that this might be a great place to store art. The wood is from 1943, and it still looks new.
The 1943 wood is shelving put in by the Nazis to store more than 12,000 works of art. But when American forces arrived, a month after Hitler's death, the entrance to the mine had been blown up.
The German commander in the region gave the order to destroy everything.
The U.S. Army sent in a specialist military fine arts unit who became known as the Monuments Men. They discovered the bombs had not damaged any of the treasures. By the time they had emptied the mine, they had filled 80 truckloads and recovered art worth more than $3.5 billion. But it turns out the real heroes of Altaussee were the mine workers, who have a long tradition of resisting authority.
I believe from this tradition there was a resistance to Hitler. There were bombs in boxes here. The mine workers carried the boxes out. They just destroyed the entrance of the mine, and the artworks were saved.
What the Monuments Men didn't realize is that they had not only recovered Nazi-looted treasure, but also Hitler's missing paid-for art collection. At the time, no one cared.
They swept everything into one clearing center, I think it was in Koblenz. There, everything got mixed up. It doesn't seem to have been properly documented. And then it was decided if it doesn't belong to the French, or Russia doesn't stake a claim for it, then they gave it back to the states of Austria or Germany, from whichever country it might have come from.
With his personal art collection scattered and his property empire in ruins, the Allies gave the German rights and royalties of Mein Kampf to the state of Bavaria, leaving little of any real value. This is how they came to calculate the worth of his estate at only $60,000. But as the file on Hitler's riches was seemingly closed in 1948, America's secret intelligence agencies already knew this was by no means the complete picture. This rarely seen, previously classified report by America's Office for Strategic Studies, the precursor of the CIA, reveals that as early as 1944, the OSS knew that Hitler had access to a massive amount of cash. In a secret operation, codenamed Safe Haven, they found Swiss bank accounts holding 45 million Reichsmarks, including one controlled by Hitler's business manager, Max Amann, containing the foreign royalties from Mein Kampf. Amann was officially the owner of the Nazi publishing house which churned out Mein Kampf. He was also the sole guardian of the Fuhrer's money.
He had a foul personality, but he was a good manager. And it was he who came up with the name Mein Kampf, not Hitler. Only Amann saw the books. Amann personally brought the account books to Hitler wherever he was, whenever it was an accounting period. There are several witnesses to this. Nobody else saw them. If he wanted money for something, he just used him as the bank.
Max Amann died in 1957, taking the secret of Hitler's money to his grave. In New York, an American forensic accountant, Ken Yormark, has spent a lifetime trying to track down the cash squirreled away in foreign banks by the Nazis.
Hitler's bank accounts are not very well known. There's not a lot of information that's out there. He had accounts in Switzerland and in Holland.
Yormark believes that the trail to Hitler's millions might not yet be stone cold.
I have been involved in cases where we were able to recoup information from 1937 going forward. It was reported that that information was destroyed. Well, in fact, it wasn't. You have to follow the funds.
Following the funds is easier said than done, as far as Hitler is concerned.
Ist berechtigt.
Even in death, the Nazi leader made it impossible to separate what was his from what really belonged to the German people.
Looking at his will, you can clearly see his megalomaniac tendencies, where he looks at Germany and he looks at himself as being one. And as a result, all the assets of Germany are basically his own piggy bank.
When Hitler died, he left behind around 20 close living relatives. His sister Paula was next of kin, and the one who followed the funds to try and find the piggy bank.
Meinen Geschwistern abzutrennen, ebenso vor allem der Mutter meiner Frau.
His will clearly stated that Paula and a half-sister should have their standards of living maintained for their lifetimes. When the Allies confiscated all his known assets, she went to court to try to get them back. In 1960, after a 12-year battle, a Munich court ruled she was entitled to 2/3 of his estate. The remainder went to her half-sister and brother, but they put no value on it. The next step would have been to identify what legally still belonged to her brother and how much it was worth. Paula Hitler never got that far. She died in June 1960 at the age of 64, 4 months after her victory. The court subsequently ordered that any benefit from her brother's estate would now pass to her heirs and relatives.
The bank has the obligation, after an account has been inactive for a specific amount of time, to reach out to that individual and try and find out whether they actually are still alive. If, in fact, they can't find that individual, then they have the obligation to reach out to an heir to try and find that heir. If one of Hitler's relatives were to attempt to do so today, I think it would stir some significant controversy. They would potentially have the right to attempt to try and claim some of those funds.
Not only have the banks failed to reach out after all this time, they've almost certainly taken advantage of a new law.
When an account becomes dormant and ultimately goes to the state, they can't use those funds. So there are big issues right now, for example, in Switzerland, where there's just recently been passed a ruling that after 62 years, an account would actually pass to the government.
It's now been more than 70 years since Hitler's death, so the new law ensures that any cash the Fuhrer did have will never be seen, meaning someone, somewhere, has made a tidy fortune. Adolf Hitler's name and image is still earning. This is a music video from Thailand. The band don't want it to be seen anymore, but it's still on the World Wide Web. In India, there was a chain of Hitler tailors. In Bangkok, there is a group of fast food outlets. When a collection of his luxury Mercedes was put up for sale, it fetched $8 million. There are now all kinds of auctions involving items said to have been owned or used by Hitler. A signed copy of a 2-part edition of Mein Kampf went for $64,000 to an anonymous online buyer in January 2014. And Mein Kampf will soon be available for all to cash in on.
Copyright ends 70 years after the author's death, which means copyright will be free and open. It will pass into the public domain at the end of 2015. And, well, starting with on January 1st, 2016, everybody is basically allowed to do with a text whatever he wants.
Some are already doing whatever they want with the book.
A colleague of ours recently traveled to India, and he discovered this version, English version of Mein Kampf in a bookstore in Delhi, New Delhi it was, I believe, right next to a biography of Gandhi. And it is presented here on the back of the book that it will give you an insight into one of the greatest evil geniuses of the last century. We were flabbergasted, I think the British term is, by this, because everybody would probably subscribe to evil, but not so much to genius.
Hitler has even become a satirical attraction on social media.
Oh, well, maybe not. What?
I can see that.
Oh, yeah.
Hipster Hitler is a comic book with a very 21st century genesis.
We were talking on Skype, and we'd always wanted to do a comic together. One of us said something like ironic Hitler, and the other person said hipster Hitler. And we were like, oh, that has a ring to it.
So I said, oh, I'll draw something right now.
And we put it up, and then we woke up the next morning, and there were like 50,000 hits on the website, which was weird.
So then that's when we decided to actually make it a full comic. Hipster Hitler is basically a comic that envisions Hitler if he was openly treated as a hipster and acted to an extreme level of hipsterism in that World War II period.
There are a lot of traits Hitler had that were in line with what we consider the modern hipster. He was a vegetarian, he was a big animal rights activist. The comic I have open is called Rhineland. So it's about Hitler deciding to reclaim the Rhineland. And in the comic, the reason he takes it back is not because of territorial issues, it's because it contains hops, flax, and hemp, which can be used to make beer and hemp for, like, T-shirts. So he's happy for that reason.
I think Hitler would absolutely put this on the list of books to burn.
An even greater irony is that the publishers of Hipster Hitler pay nothing for the use of his image. Any other well-known person would cost them money, because they would almost certainly have an agent. Like Mark Rossler, who is based in Indiana and specializes in representing deceased stars like James Dean, as well as other more infamous celebrities, earning him the nickname Agent of the Dead.
We've often been approached by family members of people like John Dillinger, to the son of Sam, to Al Capone, people like that. Whoever owns those intellectual property rights can continue on and not only protect those, but continue to receive the income stream that comes from those intellectual property rights, which can often be very substantial. In the case of Hitler, we know about his book. We know that upon his death, those copyrights were assigned or conveyed to someone else. In addition to that, it is possible that certain family members could take out trademark registrations to his name or even his image. But the third area, in the right of publicity, it's a right that we all have, whether you're famous or not famous or infamous or not, and that's generally the right that someone would have, a descendant or an assignee, to protect the name and likeness and the overall goodwill associated with Hitler. You know, so it could be goodwill, badwill, notoriety, infamy, whatever.
Infamy and notoriety have always been part of Hitler's image. And it's emerged that he was well ahead of today's game when it came to cashing in. In 1921, when he became leader of the Nazi Party, Hitler appointed this man his official photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann. It made them both rich.
Now, it was Hoffmann who had the great idea of copyrighting Hitler's image. And nobody then could do anything without paying the fees to Hoffmann's agency, which of course then came to Hitler. They had a copyright on any Hitler image, anything and everywhere.
When they put his head on Germany's postage stamps, few realized that the man himself was getting a personal commission for the use of his image. It's almost certain that no one will ever know exactly how much Adolf Hitler was worth when he died, nor what the real intentions of his personal will were.
Die entweder jüdischer Herkunft waren oder für jüdische Interessen arbeiteten.
For the man who first translated Hitler's will in 1945, the place where it was found will always evoke strong memories.
I was a 20-year-old boy, a boy, yes, who experienced quite a lot. There's no life here whatsoever. That's funny, isn't it? You don't see any birds. I think the birds must realize what happened here before. I think there must have been a Hitler who wasn't exactly the type he projected to the German people, but there was an inner private Hitler, and that private Hitler wanted to make use of the position which he had, the use of the power which he had. But he knew that he's going to commit suicide, yes? And therefore he said, no, I have to make a will. He wanted to show his ambition was purely for the German people. And a man like that wanted to project that image for eternity. That's why he made this private will very, very little. What was the real Hitler, I think, will take many years to find out.